Kia ora tātou. Hey, thanks for that, guys, and apologies for the slight delay there. We've got a pretty jam-packed couple of days. We want to get rolling. Day one's always a good start. So, kia ora koutou. I'm Kieran Smith from Recreation Aotearoa, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning. So, born and raised in Canada, Kurt is also a citizen of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, West Indies. He has resided in several countries around the world, including SVG, and I hope the acronym there is okay.
You got it.
Sweden and South Korea. He's been a resident in Aotearoa, New Zealand for the past 8 years. Kurt has 30 years of professional aquatic experience. I was 7 when he started, so that's good. And has achieved certifications as scuba, freedive instructor, sailing skipper, CPR, first aid trainer, swimming, water safety instructor. Kurt is also an educator with certifications in teaching English to speakers of other languages, as well as postgraduate certificate in tertiary training. Kurt leads multiple projects in Aotearoa spanning the fields of aquatics, youth education, and a common focus on community cohesion and social justice. He is currently a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Waikato, investigating social justice in aquatics via his African and West Indian ancestry. Wicked. That's such a cool introduction to do, mate. And I think everyone please welcome Kurt.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that introduction. I actually wasn't going to do the introduction, but this cuts out part of my talk, so that's fine. Greetings, everybody. I'll probably stand over here, and thank you for coming. And I'm going to get right into it because I've got a lot to say in a very short time to say it. It's a 40-minute presentation. I'm going to squeeze it to 30 minutes, hopefully. So bear with me, but the real purpose of this is just to skim over some things and really lay the foundation for a talk later. So right before we talk, first of all, no conflicts. I'm here on my own dime. I'm not representing any other organization, just myself. So any partnerships or things that I have externally may or may not be reflected in this, so don't take things that I say here to be the voice of someone else. Discussion is welcome. These are going to be some difficult topics. And, jump back from the vocabulary. I am going to be using some terminology from different indigenous populations around the world. I don't use terminology unless I think I really have to use it because it's the correct word to say. So I do it with respect. I try and understand the word the best I can and welcome any feedback from the room about that as well. And these are difficult topics, and I'm going to be critical in my approach because I think we need to be if we're going to do this, but I'm here to lift each other up, or lift ourselves up, not tear ourselves down. And that's how I'm going to approach this, and I'm really hoping the same from the room as well, and from the conference as a whole. So once we have all that, we're going to jump through, and like I said, I'm going to be moving really quick. Don't worry about that. Already did that, but that's my natural habitat with a regulator in my mouth at about 20 to 30 meters. So get a sense of who I am. Don't do that. There we go. And a reminder of the theme of the conference. And I really do think this is an important part of this theme. How do we actually navigate this? Okay. And this is basically what I'm going to cover, and very similar to the abstract that I put out. Just saying that this is building off another presentation I did 2 years ago at Waves. Introducing JEDI, and I really want to go a little bit deeper, but like I said, I'm going to be going quick, introducing a lot of concepts, and this is stuff that we can discuss later. And I'll use the button. But I'm going to start with a little story from the World Drowning Prevention Conference. Anybody went to the World Drowning Prevention Conference in here? It was pretty cool. And it's one of those places where I actually got to be all of myself at the same time. So I got to hang with the Canadians as a Canadian. I got to hang out with the New Zealanders as a community of New Zealand, and I got to be a Vincentian. I got to represent small island developing states. There were incredibly few representatives of those groups, including the Pacific. And I was really shocked that there weren't. So it's really important to have that representation in the room. And I'll start with a little story because this is where the whole JEDI story started as far as the conference, was the research and policy workshop, which began before the conference. And I had brought up JEDI in a question of policy on policy experts and going, how do we make justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion a core pillar of our policy and process? Interesting responses. It's still in flux, even internationally. At the end of this, though, something really powerful happened. One by one, people from the global south, representing those populations, which is the term we use now, stood up and basically said, don't forget us. Don't forget that we're here. We're representing a large number of people who are underserved. And it was a really, really powerful moment at the end, and all credit to the organizers. They made room for that. They actually welcomed it. So it was pretty cool. And I feel like that vibe kept going during the entire couple of days, that there was a lot of people standing on the stage and speaking really honestly about how they felt. The organizers kind of opened the door for that. On this board was where they were collecting things for the calls to action. As soon as I found out, I immediately went out and put JEDI right in the center of the board. And you kind of see where they clustered it. I didn't do that. It was a culmination of all of us. And shout out to Tangaroa Aotearoa for their leadership and support during that time too. It was really, really important. But together, we were stronger together. And I think we made a difference because that is the #1 call to action. Prioritizing justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in all drowning and prevention efforts, from governance and priority settings to program implementation and evaluation. That's a lot. But then we got to figure out, what is this JEDI thing? Is anybody familiar with the term JEDI in here before? And this is why we need to talk about JEDI. And what I'll say right off the bat is a lot of people are familiar with DEI. And I will acknowledge there's a lot of conversations around the world about DEI at this point. Pro, con, all of that. We see in Aotearoa, there's a lot of discussion going on in that space. This is different because of the justice. And I specifically held on to this because of justice, and initially in Aotearoa because of our relationship with Tangata Whenua. That we need to look at justice as a point. And you can picture it, I said that in my last talk, but you can picture it kind of like climbing a staircase. And as you're moving more towards the top, it gets more specific. I'm not going to worry about lower ones because we say those all the time. I'm going to focus on equity and justice because those are the two that I think we're not really holding on to quite properly. Understanding equity, and you'll often hear it referred to as equality of outcome. I don't like that because it muddies the waters. And these kind of pictures where, oh, everybody gets to watch the game, that's great. That's not completely equity. Equity in its financial sense is having a stake in the game, having some ownership. So when you're looking at this picture, it's not just, oh, everybody can see the game. Everybody has a chance to play the game. Everybody has a say in how the rules of the game go and what game is being played. That is equity in its sense. So it's a much more powerful word than I think we give it credit for. And then we jump to justice, which is even more so. Is it right? Is it just? Is it fair? Those are the 3 questions you need to keep asking yourself. But it's not simple. Has anybody seen this series with Michael Sandel online? He has his entire first-year justice lecture at Harvard online and free for everybody to see. And what he does, he pits the students against each other and really challenges them to, how do you make decisions? What is your perspective? What ethical framework are you using to make the determinations you're making? That is how we figure out justice. And you see this in all the stuff that's going around the world. You see it here in Aotearoa. Perspective is really important because what is just to one person may not be fully just to another person. Very quickly, bias. Everybody hears this word all the time. Bias is that idea that I believe what I believe, and I'm not quite sure I believe what you believe. You're kind of stuck where you are. You have conscious and unconscious. So I often refer to it like this. Somebody's sleeping in the bed, they're taking up the whole bed. Anybody had this situation before? Sleeping in the whole bed, they're asleep. They have no idea they're taking up the whole bed. The other person's doing the thing, and you don't want to wait. So you start elbowing in, and you start doing this, and finally you got to give it a little shove to get the person to wake up and realize. And that person wakes up. They have no idea they're taking up the whole bed. All they know is they just got shoved, and you're in trouble. When they realize that they're taking up the whole bed, that is where it gets interesting. That's where the unconscious turns to conscious. And when it's conscious, that person has the decision to make room or stay where they are because they think you have enough room and it's all good. Bias plays an incredibly important role in that equity, in that justice, how we perceive things. Another term that's often misunderstood, ethnicity. This is a definition from New Zealand stats. Ethnicity is a measure of cultural affiliation, but I'll point out self-perceived. It is self-perceived. I identify my ethnicity, not you. I identify with what group, where do I belong? I define where I belong. And then we do this. And we create categories where we belong. Now, what's really interesting with that is you do this for long enough, and you start to believe the category. You start to believe where you belong. It becomes a social construct. But you see how all of them, there's so many ethnicities built into all of those. Are they fit for purpose? Are they really telling us what we need to know to be able to do what we need to do? And that term, othering, is a very important one because othering is a very dark term. It's been identified as a dark term. It basically means you're kind of out there. You're not really the most important thing. We'll worry about you later. The Othering and Belonging Institute in the United States, University of Berkeley, headed by John Powell, Dr. John Powell, looks at this exclusively and has frameworks around this. Using the term othering is really not a good thing. And we're constantly doing that and putting this category, well, we'll deal with you later. That's not how we work. But then we get into that ethical construct. What are our ethics that decides that? Then we get on topic of race. And we've heard this word said a lot in Aotearoa over the past while. This is a panel discussion that we did in Tauranga a while back. There's no such thing as race, but racism is real. And I helped coordinate it and was co-facilitator on the panel. But it was really interesting hearing all the perspectives because that statement is a true statement. That person, W.E.B. Du Bois, or Du Bois, depending on how you pronounce it, considered the father of American sociology, graduated from Harvard before 1900 as the first black person to graduate with a PhD from Harvard University. He struggled with this way back when, saying all these traits, they really don't mean anything. The social side of it is what we should be looking at. Fast forward to today, we have shown through evidence, through genetics, that there is no basis for biological race, none. The basis for biological race was really to support what was going on politically at the time. It was to support white supremacy. Whites were placed at the top, their traits were the best, their personalities were attributed as well to their race. Negroes were on the bottom. They were the worst. They were savage. And everybody in between kind of was given a spot. We have to keep this in mind that when we start throwing this word race around, this is where it actually came from. This was its purpose. Its purpose was to subjugate. And its purpose was to maintain power. So race, class, gender, religion, disability, all of these things we separate to ensure that the dominant class maintains power and the other classes cannot challenge that power. And once that separation is made, it's incredibly difficult to pull that back together and rebalance it. Hoping I'm seeing time. Okay, good. And this brings us to a couple of examples. So again, I do this as a critical nature. I know people who work on these things locally. I respect a lot of the people that work on both the examples I'm going to give, but we need to start talking about this stuff because we keep kind of sweeping it under the rug. These are the New Zealand stats. And ever since I came to Aotearoa in about 2017, this is what I saw at the front. This is the thing that was emphasized. And if you look at that, you would think New Zealand and European are the most at risk in drowning. And you see this over and over again. And when you see it over and over again, you're going, oh yeah, okay. This is the per capita calculations over the past 4 years. I had to do it myself because I couldn't find them. The first time I've seen them on the slide downstairs with Dan was they had per capita down in the corner. I was like, yay! This is what you're looking at over the past 4 years. Now, it tells a really different story, doesn't it? Who's most at risk? Maori. Clearly. The other two categories of ethnic and Pacific are kind of cruising on a level. And if you go back 7 years, it's even more prominent, that they're really not going up and down. New Zealand European is the lowest one, per capita, with the size of the population. Other thing to note, during COVID, massive spike in Maori drownings. And I cannot find any research or evidence which is looking at why that is. Because a massive social pressure came on the country, that happened. But it was kind of, oh, blip, let's keep going. So this is all really important stuff. And then this one, presentation in Tauranga for the multi-ethnic forum that we have. We have it every quarter, it's awesome. And I was doing a presentation on drowning and put this up for the Bay of Plenty, went over a couple numbers, and then I looked to the room and I said, I'm really sorry, but our Maori and Pacific community leaders, we can't do anything for you because you've only lost one person and we really can't spend the money. So I can't do any programs for you. You could have dropped a pin. And then I said, uncomfortable, isn't it? Because these communities do a massive amount of work in our community, not only for Pacific people, but for everybody. We work really closely together. That is othering. These are things that have been said to me directly in meetings, some behind closed doors, some in open cafes, by people who are either close to or at the head of the table of aquatics in New Zealand. The Maori comments were made with no Maori present. This is othering. And again, I'm being critical, but I'm being critical asking that we lift each other up, that we change our perspective on how we look at things. Because I can draw a direct line between how we report the stats to this seeming okay. If you really thought that the dominant group were the ones suffering the most, you'd be, you know, we gotta. That's not the case. Another story, real quick. This is back at the conference. This is the actual opening, but this is to show you what the auditorium looked like. It was really cool. And there was a panel discussion on the stage with marketing, and marketing experts were critiquing different things, and the Swim Reaper came up. And it won awards, and they were saying this is great, and this is really targeted, and this is good. And a gentleman stood up by the name of Peter Boyd, who is, if you don't know him, he's the head of Surf Life Saving Ngāti Parau. And he said, hey, wait a second, right in the middle of the thing, some of us see this differently. Spirituality is really important in drowning. Not a few minutes before, we were having a conversation with some African sisters who were saying how hard it was for them to engage because of the spirituality in drowning and the connotations attached to it. It's not that people are afraid of the water, but there are traditions around death around the water. And I'm standing at the back and I'm just smiling because I know that if my mother was sitting on the beach and this thing came down the beach, she'd scoop up her children, leave, and never come back. No questions asked. So I had always seen it as kind of, this even disturbs me a bit because I have that built into my head. Am I saying it's a horrible campaign? No, but even the data in publications cautions against dark humor and what dark humor can do to other populations that you just didn't consider at the time. So what I'm saying with all this, I really like the recent publications by Justin Scarr and Jagnor et al., who talk about the upstream. We need to start focusing on the upstream, but if there's an upstream, there's a downstream. And when we're looking downstream, we're not just looking at reduced drowning. That's probably the least thing we're looking at, because everything that we do, every social contact we have is creating a connotation which carries on in people's lives. We're affecting people's lives as they go forward, and we need to be much more careful in how we're doing that. So in industry, they look for a lot of, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Okay, I've said it before, Life Saving Victoria, that's probably my go-to program for the way they've encompassed, the way that they started, the care that they've taken in creating what they've created over there. I think it's awesome. We can do assessments. Canada Red Cross actually commissioned a report to look at whiteness and Eurocentrism in their instructor program. They went through their instructor books and looked for it and identified it so that they could actually talk about it and make changes. I think this is one of the best survey reports out because of how they went about finding the people to deliver the survey. They worked with so many community groups and really went out on the ground to make sure that there was representation in this report. And some of you may know that this came out of Australia recently, Welcoming Australia, awesome organization, supported by Swim English, created some guidelines. But I would put to you that none of these matter if you don't know how to implement them. And the two things you need to get done first is that ethical foundation, and you need to understand why. Drowning prevention is not a why. Drowning prevention is a cause. And Simon Sinek goes very deeply into this and thinks about it. Why do we do what we do? What is the purpose? What is our why? What is the organizational why? And that affects how we look at our ethics. So, an example, Duke Kahanamoku. Everybody familiar with the Duke? Surfer, Olympic champion, incredible life, gone through it. And he's really, his story has inspired how I'm looking at things. And I'm going to play you a video that hopefully will work. Crossing the fingers. And it's not. So I am going to tell you what they're saying. He's talking about aloha, the idea of the sharing of the spirit, how aloha works, the sharing of breath. And he's explaining how important it actually is. And if you don't have aloha, you're not alive, is something that he actually says. And then we'll get to the other part. He's much better at saying this than I am. But when you hear it said, there's a quality in the voice which tells you how deep that word is. It's not just a hi. It's not just, oh, I'm connected with you. I'm deeply connected. This story is one of the Duke's most famous, saved 8 people in going through the surf, going back and forth, taking them 2 and 3 at a time on a surfboard because nobody else could go out. And when everything was done, he went out and started bringing back in the bodies. A literal superhuman feat. And what they say is a term kuleana. They translate it as responsibility, but when you hear their voices, it's much more than that. It is that connection. It is, you do it because you're connected, not because that person reminds you of family, because that person is family. That person is part of your community. And there's a distinct difference, and it guides how we see our ethics. So an example, how am I doing on to, oh, okay, I'm going to go faster. This is a program really proud of. I did in cooperation with Merge and Zed. Full disclaimer, I have no financial interest in this at this point, or no financial gain from this. This is completely Merge and Zed as a social enterprise, and they're doing it. But we did it in partnership, and it's a deaf-owned, deaf-run operation. And it was to get New Zealand Sign Language for water safety so that we can be training people in pools, in community facilities, lifeguards, et cetera, to understand basic sign. But it's more than that. Because the actual underlying purpose of this is not just the training of the sign. It's 2 swim schools, community organizations, iwi organization, and a deaf instructor in a room working together, and you see the smiles. Because they all have to do it together. They're learning from the ground up. You're creating connection. And again, I go back to Justin Scarr talking about the multi-sectoral approach. At a global level, we should be doing this at a local level, but you need to actually create this first before you can have a multi-sectoral approach, because we need to understand each other. Very quickly, this is my framework. And I say it's my framework because it's customized for me, but this is how I see aquatics. After 30 years, after 7 years in New Zealand working in the industry, all of this has started to come together. You see my purpose, stronger together. That is my why. You see aroha, ubuntu, aloha, ubuntu, the African term of connection. And there are deep frameworks around that that we can draw from. The idea of understand, respect, and community are all the process. This is how I teach. And this captures what I do. And my PhD thesis is really looking into why this makes sense to me, looking at my ancestry, looking at my background. But I think that's what we need to do, and we need to re-indigenize aquatics. Because the reality is, a lot of the things that we do today came from indigenous practice. They were taken, converted, put on the main stage in Western Europe, and now it's being taught back to the same people who actually taught them how to do it. And there is evidence for this in the historical records, quite a bit of evidence from Africa and Australia and North America, South America, Solomon Islands. That's on the top of my head so far. And of course, Duke, who was training a whole bunch of swimmers. We need to really think about re-indigenizing, putting the indigeneity back in aquatics so that we can actually do it. So to close, Aquatic JEDI, we need to be looking at a policy, decision, structure, process. Education, research, I think, is a really important one, and that goes back to my coral reef management background. Originally, it was all science. Now it's very different. It's a lot of community work. I think that approach needs to be done, and the individual, each person in this room really taking responsibility and learning more. Path forwards, all of these things, but I've mentioned all of these things, and this is what we need. I honestly think this is what we need. And I use these words very specifically, that we need to go into a room, check our titles at the door, check our egos at the door, sit around a table, and actually learn who we are and what kind of ethical framework works for all of us so that we can start making decisions. And to close, I introduce another hero, John Lewis. Anybody familiar with John Lewis? Oh, United States, icon of the civil rights movement, marched with King, met Rosa Parks. I could go down the list. But he was in Congress for a ridiculous number of years, and this is one of the things he said: when you see something that is not fair, not right, not fair, not just, you have a moral obligation to do something about it. And that's what I want to see from our aquatics industry going forward in the future, that all of us take on this moral obligation. But what that means is that we need to actually start to listen to each other. Listening is an action. Everybody wants to do something. Sometimes stopping and listening is the thing that we need to do. So this is the beginning of JEDI Aquatics, and I'd really like if we, in the future, discuss this further. I don't know if we have time for questions, but we'll go with it. And this QR code takes you to all my references and the advertisement for the online New Zealand Sign Language program, and pretty much everything that I offered. And that is it for me. Thank you very much for listening.